Hi, everyone. It's Alex Savidge at KTVU, Fox 2 News in the San Francisco Bay Area. And today we want to look at the question of whether your child should be taking part in sports, whether it's at school or maybe through a recreational league of some kind. And joining us now to talk more about this issue is Dr. Hansa Bhargava, a pediatrician and the senior medical director with WebMD. Dr. Bhargava, always good to have you.
Great to be here, Alex. Thank you.
All right, so I think you're going to tell us that, you know, when you're trying to answer the question of whether to let your child participate in sports, there are a lot of factors to consider. What are they?
Yeah, absolutely. And Alex, I'll just preface by saying that it has been a rough few months for most kids and
Absolutely.
most families. A lot of things have been canceled or online. So, and mental health issues are on the rise. I just saw a survey today that says Gen Zers, 7 out of 10, are actually reporting depression. So I think we do need to try and do the things that we can do. So I think sports is one of those things, but there are ways that we need to make them safer, or maybe just consider which sports we can do.
All right, so with that in mind, I think that's a good place to start. What sports do you think are the safest? I imagine it depends whether you're playing indoors or outdoors, right?
Yeah, there's several factors. So indoors and outdoors is definitely one of them. I think outdoor sports are generally safer, but adults that are around them should still wear masks. So if it's baseball and the adults are around them, definitely wear masks. Tennis is good. That's a naturally socially distanced sport. Cross country running is good, but the indoor sports, you have to be a little bit more careful. And typically, if there's a lot of kids that are clustering, like in basketball, for example, that's probably not a great idea.
All right, so we have to consider whether there is the opportunity for the kids to be socially distanced in some way while they're playing the sport. Some sports, I mean, football and basketball obviously come to mind. There's no chance for social distancing there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the clustering is important because, there was a report just out today actually about, people have said, oh, you have to be exposed for 15 minutes before you can transmit the virus. But now we saw a report today that said that's not necessarily true, where somebody got it by multiple exposures in a small amount. So nobody really knows what the research is showing, unfortunately, right now. But we do know, and intuitively it makes sense, the longer you're exposed in a cluster or groups of people, the more risky it is. So there's grades of risk when you decide to put your kids into a sport.
All right, so another question to consider is whether or not your child, if they're taking part in whatever sport it is, if they're going to be sharing equipment, right?
Absolutely. And so I would strongly recommend that they do not share equipment. And the reason is, even though the coronavirus is most likely to transmit via respiratory, so breathing on someone, talking, coughing, yelling, still, like if there's viral droplets, like a child has a cold, for example, and it gets on their helmet, that's not something that you want the other child touching and then rubbing their eyes or mouth. So I would not share equipment unless it's properly sterilized. And then even then, like the best way to do it is actually to stick to sports that don't share equipment for sure.
I think what probably concerns a lot of parents, including myself, is the idea that when you're talking about sports, you obviously are going to have kids who are exerting themselves, breathing heavily, and we just think about more of those aerosolized particles being put out into the air, and it seems to me that just sort of inherently increases the risk of spreading COVID-19.
I completely agree. The respiratory rate is higher. And if they're breathing on each other, that's a problem. That's why outside is better, because it's not going to, the aerosols won't necessarily linger. And the other part of this, of course, is also community infectivity rate. Like if your community has a high infectivity rate, like, 8, 9, 10%, or even, over 3%, as some public health experts will tell you, then that's something that you should take into consideration. And you might just have to pivot, just like we have with schools, and just pull your kids out of sports. Now, one other scenario I'll point to that happened to a friend of mine, his community infectivity rate for his family was very low, but then his son was in a baseball league, which actually traveled to another area. And that infectivity rate was high. And not only that, the last factor that I would say, Alex, is the culture of the community. Are people following the rules or not? So that is a factor too.
Yeah, that's a great point to consider here. If you're talking about your child playing sports, it's someplace close to where you live, compared to maybe some sort of like travel, soccer club or something. I mean, obviously a lot of these sports clubs, they're traveling all over the place. I mean, they're
Yeah.
traveling hours away sometimes.
Yeah.
That can pose quite a bit of risk, depending on what the situation is with the community spread wherever you're going.
Yeah, and it really is, because not only is the community spread where you're going, but also are people following the rules? Are they wearing masks? Are they clustering in large communities? Are they having a lot of gatherings because they don't necessarily acknowledge, the most safe rules? So I think that is a factor. And so in those circumstances, you kind of have to reevaluate every situation. I mean, my message is really that, if your kids can play sports safely and the community rates are low and you're thinking about all these factors, then that's great, but be prepared to pivot.
Absolutely. I think another important point here is obviously a lot of the focus is on the kids and whether they can distance from each other and whether they're sharing equipment or not. But one of the other important aspects in this whole equation is the parents and whether the parents on the sidelines, right,
Yeah.
are adhering to all of the safety rules and wearing masks and trying to distance themselves, because they're part of that whole equation there.
Yeah, and actually that's what I talked to in my blog as well. Basically, like the travel team went to a community where the community infection rate was not high, but all the parents over there were not wearing masks. They were clustering, and so that made this family very nervous. So I think it's really, really important, the behavior of people as well as the infectivity rate as well. So I think traveling is something that I would probably throw caution to.
Yeah. All right. But at the end of the day, from your standpoint as a pediatrician, when you're talking about the overall well-being of your child, their mental well-being, their physical well-being, getting them involved once again in playing organized sports could really be, quite helpful to getting them, on the right track in that regard. So if you can do it, if you feel like you consider some of the factors that you've laid out, and you feel like you can do it, it sounds like it really could help a lot of kids.
Yeah, I think especially if you're outdoors and you're moving around and you can do it safely, it would help from a mental perspective. But the key is that fine balance. Like, you definitely want to be safe and make sure that you consider all the factors we talked about, Alex.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll we'll let the parents out there will ultimately decide. But yeah, it would be good to get more of our kids out there playing sports once again. Just getting them outdoors is important during all this. I appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on to lay out some of the issues that parents should be considering here. Dr. Hansa Bhargava, pediatrician and the senior medical director with WebMD. Always good to have you on. Have a great weekend, rest of your weekend. You got the whole weekend. Enjoy it.
Great to be here,
Yeah,
Alex. Thank
thank you.
you.
Thanks for your time. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.